through life. Well, of what relevance has Martin Luther, a German monk, to do with the Shankill Road in 2017? What relevance has he to Belfast in 2017? He was a German monk. I'm sure at one time there were Lutheran churches in Northern Ireland. I don't think there are any today. So what has it got to do with us? What relevance is it to your life? Maybe you are a churchgoer, maybe you're not a churchgoer. If you're not a churchgoer, you'd say, why am I interested in religious history? It's no interest of me, I'm not religious. What's Martin Luther got to do with me today? Well, it's a very fair question, isn't it? Why should I bother about some? And others may say, well, it was a minor theological, doctrinal difference between theologians in that day, so why do we need to think about it today? Well, it is very relevant to Shankill Road. And by the way, I think you cannot understand the history of the Shankill Road without understanding Martin Luther. It'll give you a better understanding and grasp of the history of this road in this area over the years. Coming up the road, I noticed again, of course, the Methodist Church there. I knew people went there many years ago. Where did Methodism start? John Wesley. How did John Wesley come to know Christ? And through reading, or having been read at a meeting, the preface of Martin Luther's introduction to the book of Romans. The rest is history. Methodism, Methodist churches, all the various Protestant churches on this road. Many may not even realise what they owe to Martin Luther and to history. Even the divisions in our land, the divisions in this city between Roman Catholic and Protestant. Well, people would say that's Martin Luther's fault. There was one church then, why did he have to start a new church? And of course some would say, who don't know history, would say, oh, in fact someone said it to me the other day, and they said, you know, you Protestants only started at the Reformation, your church wasn't there before, you're just a new church. Well, that is not true. Martin Luther and the Reformers at no time ever denied that they were members of the Holy Apostolic Catholic Church. And I am a member of that church. I hope you are too, because every Protestant church are Catholic. Now the word has changed, but that would be a study all on its own. In fact, I'm just throwing some facts as they come into my mind. I haven't checked this out, but as someone who works in a certain government office, civil servant, told me recently that they were told they're not allowed to call people Roman Catholic anymore because that's an offence. You have to call them Catholic. I'm going, what? And it's not offensive. And I remember back to the George Cross, read in history. Malta, was awarded the George Cross because of their hopes. You can see it if you've been in Malta. Do you know at that time the church authorities wrote to the British government and said it was very offensive because in the citation they put Catholic Church. And they insisted it must say Roman Catholic. It's not being offensive calling people Roman Catholic because they owe allegiance to Roman Catholicism, which of course is headed in Rome. But anyway, it's just by the way. But where did all this come from? Luther was not starting a new church. Luther went back to the gospel of the apostles and the early church, just as, of course, I'm sure you've done lectures on St. Patrick. Yep. St. Patrick, there were no Roman Catholics in Ireland when St. Patrick was here. The papacy had no church in Ireland. It was the old Celtic church, but that's another subject. Well, why is it so relevant today about Martin Luther, and why are we having these exhibitions? Well, reading history, that most historians are very hesitant and reticent about attributing too much emphasis on one individual in history. And there is a great danger in that. Because generally it's movements and you can be too much on one person. But yet, the strange thing? That is not true about Martin Luther. That is not true. You cannot overestimate the influence of Martin Luther on modern history. And I'm not just talking about Christian church history. You cannot overestimate his importance. For instance, let me give you a couple of quotes. Time magazine, That's not a strong Protestant Christian journal, is it? Time magazine, I was getting it every week. It was a special offer, that's why I took it. Cancelled it lately. 65% off or something, but didn't read most of them. But it's very influential, I'm sure you've all heard of it. Do you know what they wrote in an article? Martin Luther, the last medieval man and the first modern man. Historian Kurt Allen, the intellectual life of the modern age would not have come into existence without Luther and the Reformation. The man who changed the world, that's what I call this little booklet we did, the man who changed the world, because that's a common quote in history. He's often called the most important man in history in the second millennium. In other words, from the year 1000 up to 2000. Martin Luther is the most important individual who ever lived in that period. There are more books written by Martin Luther on shelves than any other Christian writer. Do you know there are more books about Martin Luther than any individual except the Lord Jesus Christ? So he must have a fairly big importance. Must have a fairly big importance. Martin Luther, the monk that shook the world, he's been called. Well, we could tell a lot about his life. Just very briefly, you need to understand the conditions in which he was born. And we're not being offensive in this, but he was born under the domination of what's known as the Dark Ages. That's what historians call it, the Dark Ages. The corruption of the papacy. You see, there are historical arguments behind the Reformation that secular historians can record, and one of them was this, that normal people who were not much interested in doctrine or theology were sickened with the papacy because of its corruption. You know, of course, 3 popes at one time were at wars against each other. You think of the time a pope's army butchered in the 12th century a whole town of people, Albigensians. In other words, they didn't recognize Rome, they used the Bible, and it butchered them. They were killed. There were more people killed in one day by the Vatican's army than all the Christians who were put to death by pagan Rome. Now that's historical fact. That's historical fact. And there's a program I didn't watch on television, The Borgias.
Oh, brilliant.
Well, yeah, brilliant, but doesn't it, you know you've all seen the film The Godfather. Where did Martin Puzo get the idea of that? Did you ever read as the introductions where he got the idea? He got the idea from the papacy at the time of Martin Luther. Yes, that's a fact, you check it out. The corruption of the papacy and the murders of others who occupied the throne, of putting 14-year-old sons into power. When you go and tour Luther's house, you know what the official guides tell you by the German government? That the Pope ordered, he wanted money from the people, and the way to get it was to say, look, if you want to commit a certain sin, we will give you a document and you pay for it, and before you even commit it, it's forgiven. And if your loved ones are in purgatory and you pay for this money, it'll get them out quicker. And Martin Luther was furious. Furious. That's what started the whole thing off. He said, you can't buy forgiveness. A man called Tetzel came with a big drum, and he would call people as soon as the coffers, or as soon as the money hits the bottom and so on, your loved one's soul will be released. One man, this is a true historical account, actually robbed him of the big chest with the money. And he was, you can imagine what he was saying to him. The man says, hold on, I bought an indulgence off you, forgiveness for robbery. That's a true fact. Well, when Martin Luther put that up, that's what started the whole thing off. And it got into a theological debate, and he was charged with heresy, and he started to read the Bible. He never saw a Bible till he was 20. When he grew up as a little boy, it was superstitious. His brother died, his mother believed it was a witch. That was the responsibility. He said that when he heard the name of Jesus Christ as a child, he hid in terror, he was afraid, because he was taught Christ is wrathful and will damn you. And he hated that name. In school it was brutal. Brutal. Well, he went to school, did very well, took a lawyer's degree at a very young age. Genius. But at age 20 or so, lightning almost killed him. He immediately fell to his knees, and Anne, deliver me. Because he lived, he went into the monastery. At 20 years old, he found a Bible in Latin, and he began to read it. That's what opened his mind. He began to see, I need to be right with God, or righteousness, and I'm not righteous. And he tried his best. And then he came and said, I hate God. Why? Because to be in heaven I have to be righteous, and yet I know I can't be. I know I sin. And I do and we went there a couple of weeks ago and saw where he would lie on the floor at night and he would pray, and he couldn't get peace. I can't get rid of this sin. But then one of the superiors came and said, Martin, don't keep persecuting yourself. Think of the love of Christ. He never thought of the love of Christ. Imagine that. We take all that for granted. And he said, why don't you study to be a professor of theology? And he did. And that meant he could read Greek and Hebrew, and began to read the Greek New Testament. And he saw just let me be doctrinal for a couple of minutes, he saw a great truth, the great exchange he called it. Yes, God is holy, and for us to be in heaven we must be sinless. But what God demands, he donates. Not as he called the great exchange. What God demands, holiness, he gives us a free gift in the Lord Jesus Christ, because he lived that righteous life we could never live, and then he died to take the penalty of my sins, and I can be right before God. In myself I know I'm a sinner, but God can account me right because of Christ. And the burden lifted. He saw it. Of course, he had gone to Rome. He was so excited. That was a year or two earlier. He was sent by the monastery. Fantastic to see the holy city. You know what he said afterwards? If there's a hell, Rome's built over it. The murders, the immorality, the mockery. See, by the way, services were in Latin. People didn't understand. They said the priests were mocking. Now, not all priests, but many of them were mocking. He saw the gross immorality of the church leaders, their massive palaces and so on, and he was sickened. But he came to see the light. He began to publish to the common people that the gospel, you don't need the priest, you don't need the church, just trust Christ, believe in him. And of course that was loggerheads with the church. Well, the rest is history. But let me get back to this. Why should it interest you? Well, individually we need to be right with God, but that's the preacher's hat. But now, do you know Martin Luther changed the world educationally, socially, morally, scientifically, musically, politically? We would not be living the life we live today if it wasn't. Now, I would argue as a Christian, and I disagree, I go further than some of the secular historians, or all of the secular historians. They can trace that, the great change. And even Roman Catholic historians do that. But we go and say it's because of the gospel he found, the freedom in Christ, freedom of liberty that we take for granted, freedom of conscience. That's all comes from Martin Luther. When one monk stood before the pomp of the Roman emperor and all the church leaders and said, my conscience, I'm bound to my conscience. For a man to go against his conscience is a dangerous thing. Here I stand, I can do no other. Convince me from Scripture I'm wrong, I'll recant. But I cannot recant unless you show me. Here I stand. God help me. That changed the world. A man. And what I'm saying is, ordinary people, while they may not have backed him theologically, they said, what courage. Well, very quickly, educationally. The idea of schools for boys and girls, you know where it came from? Martin Luther. Do you know, up to his time, they didn't go to school. Girls didn't go to school. Very few. It was only the rich went to school. Martin Luther promoted education. He wrote letters to 50 towns saying, educate the children. Educate the children. Send it out. So educationally, he's known as the father of modern education. Linguistically, do you know up to that time they were all different German dialects? But what happened? What happened there? Well, I don't want to get into too much. He was actually kidnapped when he was given 21 days to recant or he'd be burnt at the stake. But because some princes backed him, he was able to get away. And on the way, people kidnapped him. Nobody knew who he was for 10 months, but it was friends kidnapped him. And he translated the New Testament into German at that time. And they say he's the father of the German language. He brought the German nation together because there were different dialects. And he brought it far, far more than the King James did for our English language. What about education socially? You know, it's good to see the ladies here. Do you know Martin Luther, and there's been books written on this, Martin Luther changed the position of women in society. Under Greek and Roman culture, and even Roman Catholicism, women had very little rights. Very little rights. Marriages were just convenience. They were treated little better than slaves in many cases. Martin Luther, though he himself didn't want to get married, but his future wife escaped with some other nuns when the Reformation was spreading in fish barrels. And all the others got married except her. And they wanted her to marry somebody old man, and she said no. She said, I'm going to marry Martin Luther, and his friends said they don't do it. And he says, no, I'm too busy to get married. A lot of things, we could buy, there's books written on his marriage. It's interesting, by the way, the city hadn't changed the big rug on his bed. There was a animal skin for a year. Hadn't changed his bed for a year. That's why he needed a wife. But anyway, he's famous. He finally agreed to marry her. He wrote, I married her for 3 reasons. To make the angels glad, the devil's mad, and to spite the Pope. But he did come to love her. And he wrote, even before he was married, because he did say that, see, marriage was looked down upon. And you see there, it was the priests. They were the holy people. They could please God. But ordinary people, you see, he changed that. He said, this is wrong. If you're a barber, if you're a farmer, if you're a milkmaid, you can serve God just as much as a monk. Of course, he believed in pastors and teachers, a calling. But he said, you in your day-to-day work and as a husband, a wife, you can live for God's glory just as much as any priest. So he's doing away with all that hierarchy. Doing away with all that. And he did come to love her. In fact, he said some things. Luther had a harsh tongue. And he said something that seemed a bit irreverent. He said how much he loved her. And when two children died, how he went through that. And how much he loved her. He said, at home, everything to do with the home and family. Katie. And it's a play on words in the German. Catherine, Katie can mean a treasure as well as the nickname Katie. He said, Katie is my Lord, and I obey everything she tells me. Just to call us husbands. All right, lady. He said, but in everything else in life, I obey the Holy Spirit. Not good for a minister to say, but he did love her. She was a very strong woman, by the way. Very strong. And because the day he was married, the elector gave him 100 crowns as a wedding gift, and Luther wouldn't take it because Luther would never take money. A cardinal went to visit Luther during their struggle of the Reformation and wrote back to the Pope that the man's a fool because he's not enticed by money, silver or gold. He doesn't want it. But you know what his wife did? They were married that day, brought back to the house. She got up in the middle of the night and walked the miles in the dark to the elector and says, can I have the money? She also, by the way, supplemented the money by making beer. Shows you when you go there, the thing. I remember an elder on the word, Mr. Johnson, you're saying she sold beer. Well, so she did. But anyway, right. Socially, he did talk. The place of women was changed. And I don't want to get into the whole issue of divorce, but you know, that is one of the things actually. In Protestant areas, divorce was introduced in certain cases. It wasn't allowed in Roman Catholic countries. But he felt for the sake of women who were in terrible relationships, and he felt the Bible in cases did just, and that was introduced in Protestant areas very quickly, that there were occasions where divorce was permitted legally. So in that area he changed things. Politically, this is the best one, I suppose, for when we think of the Shankill Road. We take liberty for granted. Came through Martin Luther. Nation states. Martin Luther. See, there's one great empire there, and really the Pope ruled. No one knows Roman Empire, but he did what the Pope said, or the different popes. Martin Luther stood for freedom. If you ever go to Geneva, there's a great wall, 200 and some feet long, of the reformers. There's famous statues, massive. 4 massive ones. I've been there and I must admit I missed this. There are 4 statues. There's a smaller one of Oliver Cromwell. There's a lady on it. There's a small one of King William's grandfather, William the Silent, the first of the House of Orange. You've heard that word before, Orange. Well, William the Silent was a Roman Catholic, but he was converted and became a Lutheran, a follower of Luther. And then he was assassinated. He's called the Silent because he was a confidant of the emperor, and he heard them plotting to murder Protestants, to butcher them. St. Bartholomew's Day, you know, when tens of thousands of Protestants were butchered in France. I'm sure you know about that, how France was decimated. So many came to Northern Ireland. Molyneux, for instance, Huguenots fled France, the Protestants who survived. We're talking of tens of thousands. Well, a similar butchery was about to take place. Silent. He never spoke up, but he went out and warned the Protestants in that area. So he had become, and then he chased the Spanish out of Holland, and of course he was the forerunner of our King William that we talk about, the Protestant prince, stadholder, who came over. He's on. But what I didn't know, saw this on the internet, it's a massive 20, made out of concrete or stone right along, but at the side, and I missed it, I'm sorry, there's a relief built into the stone. You know what it is? Now this is to do with reformers. Geneva erected this in 1909 to 1917. They took in building it. It's a world sight. People, thousands go to see it. And at the side they have built into the stone King William and Queen Mary receiving the Bill of Rights. You say, what's the significance of that? Even Swiss Presbyterian leaders, with Switzerland of course is what we would call Presbyterianism. In fact, I think there's a Presbyterian minister from Northern Ireland's the minister now. Someone told me. I think so, in the Geneva Church, where John Calvin it would be. In other words, those Swiss people in the early 1900s recognised that the reformers, Martin Luther, then of course others followed and stood with him, they were responsible for the freedoms politically that led to the whole revolution settlement, King William, Queen Mary, the Boyne, our freedoms, the Bill of Rights that forms Western democracy. Don't let anybody ever tell you the Boyne was just an insignificant battle. Yes, there weren't many killed compared to other battles such as Aughrim, but it changed the whole course, and James would no longer come to the throne. Freedoms, and every reputable historian, freedom of religious worship, freedom of speech, freedom of an independent elected parliament, and we're going to have that in a few days, freedom of an independent judiciary to be tried not by the government's or the king's dictate, but by independent judge. That all came. And they were recognising that in that Reformers' Monument from Martin Luther. Politically, musically. If you go to church and they sing hymns, thank Martin Luther. Well, if the person beside you doesn't sing too well, that's different, but it was Martin Luther. You see, there was no congregational singing. If you went to church in those days, you stood, of course, you didn't sit. And there was a performance in Latin, and the people had no idea what was being said. And it was a choir that sang. There was no congregational singing. Martin Luther, of course, says stop. Now, he'd nothing against choirs, of course, on occasions, but he wrote hymns. It's amazing what one man did. He wrote hymns. 34 of them. He wrote A Mighty Fortress Is Our God. With a great parade a couple of weeks ago in Portadown, 10,000 walked, and there was a service in Shamrock Park, and there was tremendous service. Different people took part, Church of Ireland, Presbyterian, I took part, others, and with a great service, and the choir sang that. A mighty fortress is our God. Do you know that's been translated into over 200 languages? Martin Luther wrote the music and the words. When you go to Wittenberg, you see the big thing, a mighty fortress is our God. It's 70 translations into English. He introduced music into the church and congregational singing. He introduced Bible, he introduced sermons in the language of the people, because the priest just spoke a bit in Latin. And by the way, he had harsh things about long sermons. Interesting, isn't it? We might think he was long, reading them, but he was scathing. He said, I prepare my sermons for the young people, and I deliberately pick out country sayings, and there's usually 50 professors from the university there. If they want to stay, they can, but if they want to go, they can leave if they want. But I aim my sermons at the young people. Well, there's so much. Luther has affected us today, musically, you've heard of Johann Sebastian Bach? The composer of the Reformation. Now, he lived a couple of hundred years later. Why is he called the composer of the Reformation? Because he was a follower of Luther and a theological library, and everything he wrote was to the glory of God. He changed music, he changed so many ways. And of course, the gospel spread. There was the great schism between Roman Catholicism teaching one thing, Protestantism. We've all from that, and we're left today, of course, on Shankill Road over the years of different Protestant churches, be the Presbyterian, Church of Ireland, Methodist, Baptist. Yes, there are small differences, we would say, but they're all united on the same doctrine that Martin Luther taught. I don't agree with everything Martin Luther taught, said, or did. Sadly, in his later life, he wrote some terrible things about Jews, not because of their race. You see, there are critical historians, and it will come up this year, say he was the forerunner of Hitler, and Hitler did try to quote Luther, but Luther did not write that we can't defend the things he wrote, to be honest, towards the end of his life. But it wasn't because of their race. I don't have time to go into it. It was because that he was very favourable to them in the early days. Very favourable. Remember, they've been put to death in the Roman Catholic Inquisition, literally killed. But because some of the leaders in Wittenberg wrote terrible blasphemous things about Christ and Mary that we don't even need to quote, but you just imagine the awful blasphemous things they wrote about this immoral woman Mary. And that's why he went. And knowing Martin Luther, if you read some of his stuff, he's quite outspoken. He says, well, get all Jews out of this area then, pack them up, get their synagogues out, get their books, chase them out, which wasn't right. Wasn't right, but he did that. I should have just said this. It's hard for us to imagine what the papacy was like. Borges, I mentioned that. I must admit I didn't know this till about 6 months ago when we were studying Luther. You've all heard, I'm sure, of the famous saying, I haven't gone up, the famous saying, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, I must admit I didn't know where that came from. My youngest son knew right away. There's a famous Roman Catholic historian called Lord Acton, dead now of course. He coined that phrase. And you know how he coined it? You see, history is full of enigmas, isn't it? History is full of very, very strange things when you think about it. Very, very strange. You know, we think of our own problems here. You think of 1912, the man who gave so many tens of thousands to the gun running in 1912 was, you know who that was, of course, don't you? Rudyard Kipling. Give tens of thousands. You know who else gave thousands to the UVF gun running? The devout Roman Catholic Elgar. Pomp and circumstance, land of hope and glory. He was a devout Roman Catholic, and yet he supported Lord Carson. Strange, isn't it? Very, very, history is very strange things about it. I mean, you get into, Lord Acton was a Roman Catholic historian, but because a man who happened to be an Anglican wrote a history of the Middle Ages and he didn't paint the popes as they really were, he wrote a book. Roman Catholic, think of it, a man who loved his church, and he wrote a book on the papacy, that they were ungodly, immoral, evil monsters at the time of Martin Luther in the Middle Ages. And he said, the wickedness of the men who occupied the papacy proves the dictum that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's in reference specifically to the papacy. I don't know if any of you ever read the book The Vicars of Christ on Earth. Peter de Rosso, you'll get it in the library. It's a modern, about 20 years ago. He's a man who introduced, he was a former priest. His introduction is, I love the Roman Catholic Church. I'm praying for spiritual revival in my church. I love it, but I must be honest with history, what every Protestant school child knows about history in the Middle Ages. And you know what he says in this book? Now, I didn't say this. He traces the history of the papacy right past Martin Luther. And this is what he says. Now this is him. Apart from a very few exceptions, the men who occupied the throne of the papacy were the most evil, immoral monsters that walked the face of this earth. Now I didn't write that. Those are Roman Catholic. So all that in the background of Luther. And the ordinary person in the street, they saw the corruption right from the top down. There were, of course, some good priests, some good nuns, of course there were, who were sincere, but they saw the corruption. And when Martin Luther started, and they saw Rome against him, many of them, not out of the reasons of the gospel, they supported, and of course German feeling. Well, I've rumbled all over the place, or roamed a lot, probably here, there and yonder. There's a verse in the Bible says someone went everywhere preaching the gospel, so I've gone everywhere this morning without giving a whole background of it. By the way, an interesting thing is Luther never wanted a church named after him, and yet in North America, North America, a lot of Lutherans as well, but you take Northern Europe, so many Lutherans, millions of them. He actually, great sayings, he said, "Do not call yourself Christians after my name." Why would anybody call their name after a stinking bag of maggots like me? A great turn of phrase, isn't it? He says, "Was I crucified for you? Don't call yourself after." So, on October the 31st, there will be great celebrations. Sadly, this is very strange with us being so Protestant in Northern Ireland. Really, we don't celebrate Reformation Day the way Protestants around the world do. I know in many parts of America it's a big thing. When I lived there, every church, Reformation Sunday, the last Sunday is it's celebrated in a big way throughout all different denominations. And Northern Ireland hasn't been. And of course we don't do it in an offensive way, but we do it out of a true way. Well, I better stop or I'll keep talking.
I can listen to you.